right, theology nerds, this is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients so that you can brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, friend of the pod, you could say, is Diana Butler Bass. That's right, American church historian, public scholar of religion, and downright brilliant. So, yeah, it's going to be a fun conversation because we are going to ruin your dinner. We're talking about religion, politics, and the elephant in the room. And this is not just a podcast. This is the kickoff of a little pop-up community this election season. You could say it is an election season pop-up community of learning and solidarity. It is a time for us to get together in an online space each week and think about not just the headlines and things that are going on in this election season, trying to not go completely insane, not just trying to provide resources, connections, and community so that we can contribute to a more beautiful, hopeful transition, but also to spend some time with Dr. Bass looking at the changing shape of American religion for the rise of evangelicalism, the shifting from mainline Protestants to evangelicalism and dominance at the national level, to the growing pluralism in America, the rise of the nuns and spiritual but not religious. Like, how is all this playing out in relationship, and what does the Trump phenomenon and the white evangelical support mean? All these types of questions we're going to unpack in this class together online while having some community as the election process runs. And, we don't really know exactly when it's going to end because, Anyway, go to ruiningdinner.com and you can join up. It is donate what you can, and zero is completely allowed. We really just want to gather anyone that wants some community, some wisdom from Dr. Bass, some sanity, and theological reflection in the midst of this. And yes, ruiningdinner.com, precisely because we're going to talk about all the stuff that can, ruin dinner. Before we jump into this first episode, I want to say that in the second half, you're going to hear from my friend Ryan Eller. He's a part of a new organization called the New Moral Majority. And anyway, he'll tell you all about it. But they did just launch a brand new ad for the election season that includes voices from ministers all over the country, so including, Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza. You'll see ministers from different denominations and such. It's well worth checking out, so I just recommend going to look at it. Anyway, here we go. Dr. Bass, go to ruiningdinner.com. Come join the fun. And thanks for listening. Thank you very much. Oh, you didn't have to. You really didn't. Oh, you didn't. Awesome. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and I am here with one of my super smart friends who also is an excellent communicator and works across multiple disciplines like history and religion, and works with congregations and in the academy. And on top of it is like a high-quality human. That is the one and only Dr. Diana Butler Bass. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, Trip. I'm really glad to be spending some time with you and with people here because it's, pretty tough right now. So, and to be able to just sort of talk honestly about what we feel and what we're going through, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Diana and I were talking, on the Twitter, as all the cool people do these days, and we thought it'd be good not just to intentionally talk about religion and politics during election season, but do so in a way we could create a space for those that are looking for a place to have all those conversations that can ruin dinners in families and churches and workspaces where you have people in different places and no one knows how to hear each other. So, this is kind of our first conversation, but it's kicking off for a group. Well, we'll be having all sorts of interactions throughout election season. And you can go to ruiningdinner.com and join all the fun of the group, but we'll tell you more about it as we go. But underneath it, I think there is a need to have a space to process what's going on with people of faith that have the same deep values. And I mean, like, why in our conversation did you say yes to something like this?
Well, I'm always amazed that Christians say you can't talk about religion and politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes no sense to me, since the New Testament in particular is inherently political. And if you know how to read the New Testament with historical eyes, you understand the context in which Jesus was living and moving and doing his original ministry. It's remarkable to me how much Jesus says is a criticism of empire. And, it's just because it isn't our politics, we don't recognize it. So we say, oh, Jesus only cared about, heaven, or Jesus only cared about personal salvation. And that's just not true. Jesus was criticizing tax policy in his time. And so it's just part of what it means to be a Christian. So I grew up in traditions where I was taught, don't talk about religion and politics. My mother taught me that. Mm-hmm. And so what did I do? I went on, got a PhD in religion, and my subspecialty area was religion and politics and American history. So, she loved me anyway, but
that's good.
I broke her rules.
And underneath that observation you made, that, for a lot of Christianity today, you could get very honest, well-meaning responses that really don't know why religion and politics are best kept separate, right? Like, and you briefly mentioned the way a kind of awareness of what's going on in the first century, opens that up, right? Like, even some of Jesus's titles are political. When you put the parables in the context of a press Second Temple period Judaism, they just pop. But election season's not the easiest time to begin that conversation with friends and family. And so one of the things that I hope we do in this group is to really, like, not have to justify that our deep religious values have demands on us for how we love our neighbor and our enemy and the least of these in the political season, but we figure out how to talk, think, wrestle, process the experience together.
Yeah. And I just wrote a piece on my Substack newsletter, which goes out twice a week. And it was about this whole topic, why we have to talk about religion and politics. And there are I think one of the things that happens to us all is that we are very shaped by media and contemporary American language about what politics is. And the way that we've been trained to talk about politics is to think about it being a horse race, like the media thinks about it, between two candidates, and that there are winners and losers, and that we have to, choose sides, because at least in the United States, they're two big parties. Mm-hmm. And so you have to pick a side. But that's not the definition of politics, I think, that Christian people should largely be functioning out of. And for years, in sermons, different books I've written, in conversations at seminaries and in churches, I've been making the point that the word politics, of course, comes out of the Greek word polis, which simply is the word for city. And so politics, at its heart, its definitional heart, is that which involves the life of the city. And so I reminded people of that definition this week. And then I think some of the better places that Christians can begin that are easier is not starting with the candidate or the horse race, or, you're going to hell if you vote for Donald Trump, which I won't necessarily say out loud, but you can take what I might think about that for what it's worth. But no, I don't want to go to that point initially. It's like the place to really begin is to talk about the virtues that are presented in the New Testament, and things like hospitality, forgiveness, justice, mercy, etc. To talk about those principles, and that they lend themselves towards understanding the life of the polis, the life of the city. And so the questions that I am trying to get people to at least start talking to their brother, sister, they, them, Christian friends about is, how in the world is hospitality enacted in this particular moment? How do we welcome the stranger? What does it mean to love our neighbor? What does it mean to forgive someone 70 times 7? And it's, been interesting for people who follow the Revised Common Lectionary in their preaching, which might be some people in this group. The parables from Matthew this fall have all been really very political, and they've been putting forth these sorts of ideals in the form of parables, and asking us to consider, what does the city of God, what does the life of that city have to do with the life of the city of Jerusalem and the city of that Jesus and his followers live in. So I think that that's a really important place to start, is to start with that definition, to move that definition into the area of Christian virtue. And then you can start talking about the issue of, well, which candidate, or which party platform, or what policies do you want to see? But we all kind of think we're, MSNBC pundits, and that, or New York Times reporters these days, and that somehow we can start on the policy level or the candidate level, and everybody's going to listen to us. And that's just more shouting. If you have a whole nation made up of nothing but pundits, you don't have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. At least for me, this election is different than others, because I feel like democracy's on the ballot, that the American experiment's on the ballot. And I was in undergrad on 9/11, right? So from then on, my adult experience has been depressing. The economy takes crash, and we bail out billionaires. We lie our way into war. There's so many ways in which millennials experience of the institutions. Think of the sex crisis in the church. There's so many of these big institutions that have just failed and embarrassed themselves. And we don't have a memory of a time where we thought, well, we're probably at least 51% the good guys, and I think there's this temptation for cynicism and a temptation for opting out, and or thinking like this project we've been in doesn't have an answer. And then this election happens, and you realize, like, it's not just like gutting important things that is the difference between the parties. Right now, it's just opting out of really caring as to whether the people, your neighbors and your communities, have a voice, are even safe, and get to participate in the democratic project. And so while I'm, put it this way, there's nothing quite like a fascist to make Tripp, a Christian democratic socialist, excited about a moderate neoliberal who is probably not going to modify the military-industrial complex or significantly disengage from international abuse of global capitalism, but he'll at least join the Paris Accords, not rig elections, encourage white supremacy, and through the process, he has a higher batting average on complete sentences. So that always helps too, Yeah,
one of the things that I think I've always learned as a historian is that, you do look at the whole, and you talked about the whole really well. I mean, I'm 20 years older than you, a little bit more than 20 years older than you. And so I actually do at least have some vague memories of some different stuff, about America. Once in a while, I look at my husband and I say, God, I miss the 90s, and but but even then, when there were some things that you could kind of look back on and say, well, hey, maybe we were 51% the good people in the 90s. It was a mess too. That was when we got that first crime bill. I will never forget. I was actually in my first teaching job when the Newt Gingrich and the whole Contract on America crowd got elected to Congress. And it was one night, I had a group of students over to my house. We had been doing a big unit on religion and politics in America. And so I invited people to come to my apartment for snacks and to watch the election returns and all this kind of stuff. So we're watching the election returns, and all of a sudden we see this Congress being elected. That was really the first massively right-wing Congress of my lifetime, because I actually grew up in a world where most of the United States, years I was alive, the United States Congress was mostly Democratic. And so even if you had Republican presidents, you had these really interesting sort of, Ted Kennedy was probably one of the most powerful senators. And you had these really interesting Congresses that were committed to guarding the social safety net, expanding it when possible, checking some of the worst impulses of militarism. And those were people who grew up hating what happened in Vietnam. And so their whole worldview was very different. So I remember sitting in my apartment with these students, and we're watching these returns. And at one point, I literally broke down and started crying. And my students are staring at me. They're like 12, 14 years younger than I am at that point. And I just said, this is going to be terrible. This is going to change everything about America. And, basically what you've experienced on your side of this timeline is that almost all of the Congresses you've known were exactly the opposite of all of the Congresses I knew growing up. And so what's happened is that the presidency has to become a check, for the most part, on a Congress that's has been, by and large, committed to eroding civil rights, expanding military power, and sort of disabling the regulatory and social safety nets that were put in place for most of the 20th century. So it's been a kind of a weird reversal historically. And so anyway, as a historian, I pay attention to stuff like that. And it's also, while the big things are really important, I always try to remember the more granular things as well. And despite the horrors of the last 20 years, there have been some interesting, weird, surprising things that people forget to talk about the last 20 years. Like under the Bush administration, and I didn't like George Bush. I thought George Bush was like the worst president we were ever going to have. And yet under him, our Africa policy shifted in significant ways that improved the health and lives of most of the nations that we have significant relationships with in Africa. And that meant medicine, doctors, different AIDS policies, education policies with girls and women. And so, if you talk to people who, especially Christians in Africa, they have really good memories of the Bush administration caring about African policy. And it was really a major shift. And it was in those earlier parts of those years that there was a lot of attention towards international debt. And Christians across the theological spectrum, and Democrats and Republicans, all work together to work on relief of debt through the World Monetary Fund and the International Bank. And there was a great project around the turn of the millennium that really did free up a number of countries from debt that they owed to the developing nations. And and then I think, part of the reason we know Elizabeth Warren is because Obama put her in charge of a consumer watchdog organization that really lifted her political career. and brought progressive values right to the core of an administration that sometimes is accused of, being neoliberal, but nevertheless shifted American economic expectations in a far more progressive direction. And so I think that these little granular pieces of the last 20 years are really important to hold on to in this time of, oh my God, everything's going to hell. At the same time, even in a political environment and a policy environment that has been very destructive, there were important and productive policies that were put in place. Of course, now are all threatened or have been actually turned around by Trump. But they were there, and people did know how to cooperate, and people did see certain kinds of things that were necessary for the common good across the globe. And those were having an impact. Even in a place like Davos, people really talked still about international monetary policy and the forgiveness of debt as an important part of global capitalism. And, I don't have much to say to Davos. I mean, never been, never expect to go. I do have some friends who have been, but it's not my theological or economic cup of tea. But I do know that even there were those conversations going on. So there's a lot of bleakness, but there are also an incredible number of still really good people who are involved in these things, who are still doing the work.
One of the things that strikes me about your description is really the type of insights someone like yourself, a historian, especially one that pays attention to politics and religion, gives, in that, yes, there are these particulars, and the particulars are combined to make up history, and there's this big view, and I think both of them get ignored when you're in an anxious situation and everyone feels like the world's ending. When you feel like the world's ending, then it's not, are we going to show up? Are we going to be invested? Are we going to start making progress in the best way we can in this moment? It's the apocalypse. We need to do whatever we need to do to fix this. And then everyone needs to be placed in that type of dualistic rendering that apocalyptic scenarios get. And I just feel like that's it's the natural response in an anxious, intense time, but it's not a healthy place to live, and it may not be what actually generates the most growth and steps towards something better.
Yeah, Tripp, I'm really curious. Just when you even say that, don't you think that sort of apocalyptic vision is the main sort of quote unquote gift of evangelicalism to contemporary culture?
Yeah, I think in two ways. In one sense, if you are anticipating an apocalyptic vision of the evangelical variety, right, not a biblical one, then you, in some sense, the true story going on in international politics is a battle between God and the evil one, right? And so you're going to start interpreting things and putting them in this context. And you can see some of the, even from Second Temple period Judaism, not things that made canon, but apocalyptic Jews at that time, the way they're thinking about Roman politics and stuff. And then you can see throughout church history that there's these cycles of apocalyptic thinking, and no one goes and looks at a church and goes, you know what? Once you start shoving your history and your experience of it in a giant map, and you maybe really sweet charts, that's always good, that you end up making wise, healthy decisions. Because all of a sudden, once you know that binary and battle's going on, you're like, now exactly how are we going to put the pussy grabber on this chart? And they say, well, have you thought about Cyrus?
Right.
Have you thought about David?
Or King David? Right. Bathsheba.
Yeah, all of a sudden David's like, whoa, look, I repented. And my prayer of repentance is like in the Bible. Homeboy said he can't even think of something to apologize for. But that's why you got to throw the Cyrus in. because he wasn't part of the elect. Yeah, so I feel like there's that part of the apocalypse, and the other side is it means that God's desire for the world is evacuation. And so your deep values don't resonate with trying to figure out how the web of life and nature community can thrive going forward. And that's depressing now that we got climate change and nukes.
Yeah. And that's, I think that that's just right, is that I think the apocalyptic piece is the real inheritance of the strength of evangelicalism over the last half of the 20th century. Now, I mean, you and I, we both know what these demographics look like. Yeah, I was on a call with some Episcopal diocese earlier this week, and I reminded them that the fastest declining denomination in the United States is the Southern Baptist Convention. And what we see with all of the religious demographics is that people are running out of the back doors of evangelical churches with their hair on fire. And it's like that 81% of evangelicals who still support Donald Trump is 81% of the people who are left. And there aren't nearly as many people left in white evangelical churches as there used to be. Black evangelicals, brown evangelicals, evangelicals of Asian background, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But when we're talking classic white evangelicalism and all this kind of stuff, their numbers are down. And so they still support Trump very strongly, but there are fewer of them. But see, people always think about that. People always think about the numbers. Oh, that's huge. But they once were a lot bigger than they are now. And I think what they left to us, by and large, is this vision of fear. And it's not only a vision of evacuation, but it's a vision of destruction. And where you get that rapture, the idea that Jesus is going to take everybody away, is, I think, evangelicals were terrified by their own vision of history, which is that God was going to destroy everything in a giant conflagration fire, and that nothing would be left, and then there would be this judgment. And so, what that I remember when I was a teenager attending an evangelical church, and part of the reason I joined an evangelical church when I was 14 years old is I was afraid of death. And my Methodist church in my childhood really didn't address those issues terribly well. Didn't tell us what's going to happen after we die, or, God loves us and saves us. We talked about other things in my Methodist childhood church. So I was really terrified of death, and evangelicalism answered that. They had an answer about life and death. That I could go to heaven and Jesus loved me, and that all I have to do is say this prayer and everything was going to be okay. And so after I hung around for about a year and a half or so in the evangelical church, I wasn't afraid of death, but then I became afraid of the end of the world. And that was terrifying. And so they had another answer for that, and that that was the rapture. So, so I think what the rapture developed as was kind of this kind of second safety valve, of evangelical terror, is that you didn't have to be afraid of the destruction of the planet. You could cheer it on, actually, and at the same time understand that you wouldn't be around for it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that heightened sense of our capacity to think about destruction, and that the world is ultimately on a trajectory of complete, physicists talk about entropy and stuff, but complete spiritual entropy. That trajectory is, it's worth being terrified about. And so they left us a vision of the history always ending in despair, always ending in cataclysm, and also that there was nothing you could do about it. Mm-hmm. And so they handed on, really, this culture of fear. And I think that part of what we're dealing with right now is that so many Americans grew up within that worldview that they, even after they're gone, the fear still is part of it. And a lot of people take it over into other things. And I don't know that we've ever really dealt with the an entire generation of people being brainwashed by catastrophe and fear, and a vision of history that is so incredibly counterproductive to human flourishing.
It's yeah, I think at least one of the places that this shows back up in deep ways of people I interact with just through the podcast and reach out is that, like you said, that initial fear of death that comes up in an evangelical context can get remedied rather quick. But then you have the fear of the Lord. And this Lord's not nearly as nice as Jesus, but it uses his name. And I think that when you're in that space, all of a sudden repression about your own finitude gets attached to performing intense acts of sacrifice towards this narrative of us versus them. And people are trying to come out of that in the podcast. I've had a number of emails recently that in a sense Trump and all the people supporting him made them realize, like, this is not what I thought it was, right? But I get these emails and it sounds like that guy in the Matrix who got out and then is thinking like, I'd like to get back in, because once the whole structure of meaning, purpose, value, framing history in dealing with finitude disappears, you realize how many questions linger there, and that's scary as can be. And then what do? And I've had emails of people like, I wish I could go back and be naive again, and then people that go like, I just have to burn it all down. And then I feel overwhelmed. Like, maybe if I had a therapist, I could believe in God again. And I hear these type of things, and underneath that, I could see the desire. And I have some friends that are working on, this, how this plays out psychologically, but you see the way a group of people could desire someone who's going to wage war on their behalf, but in this world and not the next, and is going to show those people who've judged you and dismissed you in culture what it's like to be on the opposite side. And I feel like we have to understand, not just, yes, there was an attack on America going on in the middle of a presidential debate, but on the other side, there's a whole bunch of people that are choosing to stay with this narrative, and they're our neighbors and our family and friends, and just shaming and mocking them isn't going to help us figure out how to live life together. And so thinking about this history and what's going on is really, I think, is really necessary.
I just have a question. Have you ever been shamed into a better place?
Like if you get, like when I had a personal trainer, I think, like I knew I was going to, and I said, like, I'll get you, but I'm going to pay for 6 months now, so I know I'll actually show up. And it was just like the sheer pain, because I had a bet with someone. And so, like, once there's competition involved, but, normally shaming is not the most persuasive way of getting there.
No, I'm just amazed that, I've said it on one or two podcasts already. So I'm finishing up a book that I just wrote about Jesus. It comes out in March, and it's a very memoirish, interesting kind of book. But I'm thinking about my next book after that, and it's actually on the power of shame and fundamentalism. And I just shame does nothing but create cycles of shame and blame that continue on until you can somehow get out of it. I was thinking about, have I ever been shamed into something? Well, yeah, I've been shamed into, being quiet and crawling into a corner and feeling like I'm less than human. But that's not really getting someone to a new place. That's just creating more sort of guilt and, bad self-image and all that kind of stuff, where you are looking for somebody to love you or to, protect you. And so I think that some of the shaming and blaming that goes on in religious and political culture actually helped to create Trump. What you described sounds perfectly plausible to me. is that if you are in a religious tradition that has felt like you were shamed for believing the things you believed, you're going to look for a protector. You're going to look for somebody who will will punish the people who shamed you. And so that's usually the way shame works. It's mostly in Western societies. It works differently in different religious and philosophical worldviews. But in Western society, it's usually very counterproductive. It can
and I think there's
bad stuff.
One of the things about shame is, especially when your religious community has only one outline for a salvation story, is that, when you have shame, it's usually because of pain, being a victim of something, being harmed, these type of things. But if the only way you can talk about God's love and care for you is to put it in a salvation narrative of dealing with guilt, then it's like doubling down on the wound itself, right? Like, so the victim and the victimized and the victimizer are being told, like, how do you relate with God with this? Well, you have to confess it. And you're like, confess what? Being a victim? Being harmed? Like, I'm sorry, God, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oh, wait, that is what happens, right? Like, think of how many how purity culture insists. Like, I remember a college student when I was a campus minister who was sexually assaulted, saying, she's like, yeah, well, I probably shouldn't have been wearing that. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I'm pretty sure that did not, like, you were a victim. Like, you don't need to come up with you don't need to convince yourself you're guilty to make sense of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's when your religious narratives are narrowed, then you have to shove things in it. And you can see that brokenness, and then we're going to fix it by imputing righteousness narrative is like the theopolitical narrative that Trump runs around doing.
Yeah. And, I think that as well, there's Trump on one hand and how he has masterfully exploited, I think, the evangelical and conservative Catholic communities in order for, to get votes, et cetera. And I think that he's a showman. He walks into a room and he knows what an audience wants to hear. And I think that out of his own experience as, wounded narcissist and all this kind of stuff. And, if you haven't read Mary Trump's book about her family, it's really hard to read, but I did actually read it this summer. And it really helped me understand why he would appeal to evangelicals, because it's all about a strong father who doesn't really love you. It's all about how, in a sense, death, violence saves people. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that Trump sort of understands from a completely secular point of view that backs into particularly evangelical theology. And so I think that they kind of see that. So we can talk about Trump in this political moment in one way, but I think in certain ways it's almost more interesting to talk about the body politic. And that is, how is it that America got to this place? And I really am more and more convinced that the culture of evangelicalism, with all of these different things, it's apocalypticism, it's fear-based religion, it's capacity to shame and blame, it's purity culture, all these things have now left the church, as it were, and moved into our political and public debates. And, I think it's sort of shocking in some ways is that there's a purity culture that's developed among progressives. And when I see it and I talk to people about it, it's remarkable to me that so many of the people who parlay purity in progressive circles used to be fundamentalists. And so what I think that the sort of the calling is for people who are really struggling, those people you described, people who are probably here in this watching us and listening to us tonight, who used to be evangelicals and who are struggling with this whole thing and trying to find a different place, is to recognize, and I can do this because I spent years in this subculture myself, and I've also been out of it for a really long time. So I have both the experience of the culture, I have the whole deconstructive period, and now I'm 25 years past that. When she was alive, Rachel Held Evans used to call me the first ex-evangelical. So I mean, I took that as a great compliment, but see, nobody remembers it because it happened so long ago. So anyway, I have a lot of experience about this, and I know the difficulty of it. But the thing that was the most freeing for me eventually was recognizing not just the doctrinal pieces, not that I struggled with the doctrine of original sin and I couldn't figure out whether or not I was going to go to heaven or hell, and whether or not there was universalism or any of those kinds of things. The deep struggle is around those things that we've been talking about, is that how am I carrying shame that was really nurtured within the evangelical community? How am I still carrying that shame with me into this place now, where I am theologically and where I'm trying to live my life in the world in a different way? How am I carrying fear? How am I carrying a really, truly apocalyptic framework of human culture? How am I carrying those impulses to want everybody to live like me, which is basically what purity culture is that everybody has to agree with me, and that if they don't, they're going to hell. And so those are the things that I think that a lot of ex-evangelicals and a lot of people who are in the process of leaving that culture are still bearing. And I remember how long I held on to those and almost even couldn't name them after I had left evangelicalism behind. And it was not the doctrine of original sin that was ruining my life. It was shame that was ruining my life. Yeah. And so I really, I urge people when I have conversations with people is, explore those deeper pieces. And that's going to get you further down the road. And it's also going to get you to a different political place. It gets you to a different personal place, a different spiritual place, a much more grounded and interesting, I think, place. Jesus talked about the meat or getting the New Testament to talk about the meat of the gospel. I think it helps us to get there. But it also then gets us to a place where we can talk about our political choices and our political hopes differently.
Mm-hmm. So, as we transition to talking about this particular moment and even how to make sense of what's going on right now, I just want to remind everyone, that's in the stream or listening to the podcast, if you want to continue this type of conversation, you can all go to ruiningdinner.com and you can ruin dinners with us nonviolently all the way through the election, which who knows exactly how long that voting is going to take. But there's nothing like group therapy because just thinking about the different questions going on right now, there's a number of threads around evangelicals we haven't picked up, but we haven't even started talking about the nature of mainline Protestantism and what that looks like in thinking through politics in the big picture. We haven't talked about the growing pluralism in America and what that means for thinking about church and state relations and the activities of democracy. If you want to hear Diana say amazing things about that, then you should come hang out in the group. Look at that lure. That's why I talk, but that's the process people call it, the lure. But you don't have to use that word. You can call it the call of God or whatever you want. But I do want
the altar call.
yeah. But I do. I like. You started telling me things that were going through your head after the debate, and I don't like hearing them in advance because I don't want to ruin the excitement. But as someone who fell asleep right when it was starting at 2 a.m. here in Scotland and woke up to a number of text threads of friends and family and messages before I listened to the audio. My text thread said things like, "Oh shit, Trip, did you see this? Are you watching this?
Wow.
Oh my goodness, you fell asleep. I might not go to sleep tonight. Oh no, he didn't what?" Like if you just imagine people you care about, I used to be their minister, family, friends, and just looking at the thread because I fell asleep, and I used to try to lose Twitter followers every time there was a debate. Now I was sleeping, and there were a few things that popped on that I just didn't know what to do with. Individuals who are not hotheads said, "Is this the end of America? Do you think this will end in violence? What am I going to do at Thanksgiving?" Was from a friend of mine who just came out, and her family is all, Trump supporters. Like what we were seeing there, is this tearing at the threads of democracy in America and things, but it's also so for people of faith and for people in families, like there's so much going on. Like from your perspective, like how do you name it and how do you identify it so we can kind of attend to it in a thoughtful way and not just a reactionary way?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have a quick idea about Thanksgiving. Just one practical, simple thing is this year, tell your relatives you started to have a mysterious cough about 3 days before Thanksgiving, and that your worries you might have COVID and can't get a test in time, and just stay home or go or sneak out then with your other friends who you'd be comfortable with. Every single human being in America has an excuse about Thanksgiving this year. Take it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that is high quality advice.
Don't put yourself through that suffering. But that's
I've really lost
election.
taste and smell. No, we hope it's past the election, Diana. Come on, we might be we might be in the middle of a Supreme Court case then.
Yeah, we don't know, but really, if you don't go to Thanksgiving, if there's any way you can avoid it, if it's going to be painful for you, take the out. So, yeah. But the other pieces, and I want to make sure we get to really focus on this debate. It is important for everybody who watched that debate to recognize that we were assaulted. That was an assault on Joe Biden, on Chris Wallace, on everyone who watched it, and on American democracy. People talked about bullying, and yes, indeed, Trump was bullying us. But even more, it was a verbal, violent assault on us as Americans. And so if you feel crappy this week, you understood, you got it. You felt the power of what it is for a domestic abuser to do his work. And so that's the first piece of that. And that means every single one of us has to do something this week to take care of ourselves. And that is really important. So I want people to do that. And then there's a second step out of that. If you felt bad and you happen to be a person who is white, or a person who might be middle class, or a person who otherwise has some level of what we understand to be privilege or power in this society, and you feel bad, imagine how bad other people who don't have that feel. And so the next step is for people who have power and privilege, yes, indeed, take care of yourself, recognize what happened, and get off your tails and figure out what you're going to do to protect your neighbors. And that becomes an incredibly important part of this next election, and is absolutely wrapped up in what Trump himself said. Trump himself called on white supremacist militias to attack the democratic process. And people who have been worried about violence in this election, some of whom are alarmists, and you think, oh, well, they always say stuff like that. But a lot of them aren't alarmists. People who are not alarmists are now alarmed. Now, that's not a call to go back into some apocalyptic fear place and let it all, sort of make us not. I mean, the point of that kind of fear is to create an inability of good people to do anything. It's like we're going to be cowering in our homes, or we're just going to run out and vote and then stay locked up for the rest of the month. The best thing we can do is figure out ways of taking care of other people. And so I've spent most of this week since the election since the debate on the phone with a lot of pastors, a couple seminary presidents, a couple bishops, and saying, how can we commit to a peaceable vote? What can we do to make sure the vote, people feel safe voting? And so what I'm kind of envisioning is if we can manage it, and there's not a lot of time to organize anything like this, and it takes a lot of local, just sort of self-organizing. We're not creating a national organization for a peaceable vote or anything. But if those of us in all of our different local situations, our congregations, our small groups, our spiritual communities, what have you, get some number of other people to join with us and figure out what we can do to make our local polling place not a place of fear, but a place where people feel comfortable. And that would include everything from, take a group of people, of course, wear masks, be safe, all that sort of stuff. Maybe take 6 of your friends and stand at the polling place and have big signs that have the Beatitudes on them. And just stand there, for hours as people are lined up to vote, and that they have something to read that's beautiful and hopeful and is full of joy. I have a friend I talked to this week, and where he is in a city, they have several polling places near his church, and his church is going to play hymns all day on voting day from their bell tower. I have other people that I know who are buying, huge flats of water bottles, and that they're going to pass out water bottles to people in line and little baggies of trail mix to people in line so that they can drink and eat if they have to wait a really long time to vote. I also know people who are going to just hold up signs that say things like, if you feel nervous and want to pray, please come over here and I'll pray with you. There are some folks I know who work with Moms Demand Action. So this is less religious, but I think it's a really great thing, is that they're actually going to just take their babies in baby carriages and stand at polling places, moms and babies, just as a way of reminding their neighbors that they don't have to be afraid. So there's all kinds of great organizations. There's Lawyers and Callers, which is an initiative that's partly sponsored by Sojourners, where they're going to have people who are lawyers and pastors at polling places during the election. You might want to join up with something like that. There's Souls to the Polls. I'm urging every white Christian I know to call up the local pastor at a Black church in your neighborhood and say, hey, what can I do to ensure that your congregation feels comfortable voting? What do you need from your white neighbors to help you ensure the safety of the voting of voting? And so I think what can happen if we all commit to a peaceable vote is that it's a slap in the face to Donald Trump. We will not be afraid. And it gives us something to think about and do that, hey, you've been assaulted. It's a terrible thing. The best thing is not to just hide in a corner and say, gosh, I hurt, but instead acknowledge the wound, work on your personal healing, and then go out and find other people in some way, shape, or form, in a safe way, of course, during COVID, to join forces with and do something that creates the alternate reality that does not allow the abuse to take place for other people. And so those are things that I'm doing this week. And and it's interesting, I called up bishops and I said, what are you doing with ensuring the safety of the voting place this week or this next month? And most of them said, well, we hadn't really thought about that. And most of them, really nice white people for the most part, said, well, we were just kind of leaving that to the black churches. Well, you know what? We white people can't leave that to black churches. It's black people who are even more afraid to vote than we are. And so do your part, we got to do our part. And and that is going to heal our wounds and also, I think, help to heal the wounds of the nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think acknowledging that the severity of what happened is necessary, but it's also really hard because it wasn't like he had that microphone on accident, right? The president had it because the country gave it to him, and for most of us, there are people we care and love who are still glad he holds it and hopes he keeps it around. And so the acknowledging the trauma that's connected to the whole, but all this going on is it's difficult. And I've heard from people where it's difficult because in some ways there are plenty of people that are accomplices that
right.
you care and love about.
Right. And the truth of it is we cannot really control mm-hmm. what other people think and do. What we have ultimate responsibility for is for our responses and how we serve our neighbors. And I think that, a lot of this has been out of our control and it makes us feel bad. And we want to fix things. We don't want people we love to be voting for Donald Trump. But ultimately, you can't control that. But these other things you can control. And, this is where the idea of if we really witnessed to that peaceableness, there were at least a few people who would see. I mean, literally, I've gotten terrible email this month, too, telling me that every progressive in the world wants to actually kill conservatives. And I have written back and said, well, I'm a progressive. I don't want to kill anybody. As a matter of fact, I'm a pacifist, And so I think that, I could say that until, the cows come home and that person is not going to believe me. But if I'm standing out on a street corner trying to take care of people while they're voting and giving them bottles of water, it really does look a little different. I'm not throwing a soup can at you. I'm giving you a drink because you've been in line for a long time. Mm-hmm. So, I think those are the only kinds of things that actually at this moment, the words, for you and me, this is really hard to take, but, at this moment, words don't mean nearly as much as acting out the words that we believe to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. And, for a minute, I want to invite one of my friends, a fellow wild gooser like ourselves, which I'm eagerly looking for the return to the goose. But Ryan Eller is organizing a super PAC, right? Isn't that right, Ryan? You got to unmute yourself. Called the New Moral Majority. He's also was for years director of a number of different nonprofits, right? You've been a part of our political action groups, worked a lot on immigration and immigrant rights and stuff like that. We went to divinity school together at Wake Forest University. Go Deeks. And he was a Baptist minister, been in the military, and a political activist. So I'm super pumped you're here, and hoping we can gain a little wisdom for those that are new to being explicit and forward about their faith because this election and this question is all of a sudden not permitted us to bifurcate religion and politics.
But maybe we can do this kind of initiative to get the word about a peaceable vote out through your channels. It's perfect for you, actually.
It really is, and I really appreciate all that you are doing, Diana, because I think what you have been speaking to in recent weeks is voting as a spiritual discipline, and the responsibility that we all have as human beings, but also as people of faith, to be present in the public square and to use the vote as one critical tool, in our toolbox. And so it really is valuable. And I'm excited about this conversation. We are on the heels of tomorrow, maybe even later tonight, releasing our first advertisement called a Sermon to Heal America. And we have preachers from around the country that many will recognize, who have given sermons, and we've put all of those together into a single sermon to try to get us to focus on common values and on our collective ability to have an impact through the vote this election. And we've taken the stand in a really unprecedented way to go ahead and say that we're voting for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I know not a lot of people in our circles have always been comfortable doing that, but I think we are in some pretty unprecedented times. And so, we're excited about that ad. And then next week, we, in collaboration with another group called Faith 2020, are going to be launching what we're calling Operation Family Meeting, where all of us, you mentioned earlier, the family members that we pray for and pray about, who may not be voting or who have not yet decided to vote in the way that we would. It's a toolkit for how to have those difficult conversations for people who are undecided yet about voting, or who have not yet decided to vote for who we think is the more moral of the two candidates, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe you could share a bit about, when you and I had a conversation not too long ago, and just about the demographics and stuff of the kind of unseen and unacknowledged religion voting block. And maybe you could share a bit about it, and then Diana dialogue with you about it, because basically I was matchmaking this conversation about this particular topic, and so that's my softball, and now I'm going to watch you two talk about it, because I'm just kind of excited. This is what I was wanting to do.
Yeah, I've got an article out in Religion News Service where I am trying to suggest that what I call the forgotten faithful are those who will be the decision makers in this election cycle. And a lot of folks hear that lingo and think that I'm talking about white conservative evangelicals, but I'm actually not. The former moral majority, where we got our name, was neither. And what I'm really talking about is this group of people who largely did not vote in 2016 at all, or who did and didn't vote for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or this small group of polls suggest roughly 12% of people that are still undecided. Most of those, if you drill down the demographics of the current undecided group in the U.S. electorate, it's overwhelmingly women, and it's mostly women between roughly the ages of 25 and 45, and mostly suburban women. And in previous elections, that may have assumed that meant white women, but it's actually more representative of women of color. And so you see in places like Florida, for example, Latina women, a lot of whom are mothers and may not care a lot about politics. They don't plug into the news every day, probably because they've got 20 million other things that our society forces them to do. They're still in many cases undecided. And so those are the folks that we're trying to reach, because they may not have seen the debate the other night. They may not know that Donald Trump gassed some of our family members to have them removed from a church so he could take a photo op, or even some of the racist statements that he has made. And so these are the folks that we're trying to reach. Half of all Catholics, for example, don't even know that Joe Biden's a Catholic. And so they just released a radio ad today from a member of his parish to make sure everyone at least knows that he's a person of faith. So those are some of the groups. And I think that that's why a lot of my more progressive friends in movement spaces have suggested that, we're talking too much about religion and this election, and why is faith getting so much airtime? And I think it's because of that, but I also think it's because of what Diana was talking about, that we're in this moment in our world where people feel overwhelmed. And in moments of deep peril, we often turn to our faith when we're looking for character and what shapes our character. No matter what the faith tradition, people look to faith as one element of identifying how we shape our character. And so to me, it's not a surprise. And I actually think we ought to be talking more about our values, more about our morals, and how they would guide us into the future, instead of just talking about the past.
Wow. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say there, Tripp. Ryan, thank you for that work. I mean, I've thought a lot, about women like that through this whole election cycle. It's very weird, frankly, to be a woman who's cared about religion and politics my whole life, and to have actually studied it, on the levels that I studied it, because whenever the religion and politics argument comes up and I'm invited into a room, oftentimes I'll be one of the very few women who will be in that space. And yet, for women, politics is so key to what happens in the domestic space. And, the women that you're describing, even everything to childcare needs and health, certainly health insurance, which is so on the burner right now, but also rent prices and loan policies and redlining and all kinds of things play into how they are able to actually care for their families, and whether or not they can put food on the table, and if they can get great, safe health care, and also great, safe childcare. And so they're usually working so hard that they don't even have time to think about policy issues or theories related to, church and state and how that has an impact there. So, I'm really interested in how we find conversations with those women, and a lot of times the only civic kinds of space that those women enter into are either the space of the public school, which nobody can go into right now because of COVID, or also the space of church, which of course some people are still able to link up through online means. But in places like Arizona and Florida, the church is being offered. And it's somehow the messages of faith need to also speak to those political realities and help those women understand that who they vote for president and local office is actually going to make a difference in their lives, and that we can, and that this is a whole of a piece. It's not a divided thing, and women love thinking holistically, and so to pray with a woman about these kinds of issues is also, it is a political act, and to have tea and enter those conversations. I love what's the initiative that Carolyn Davis is doing? It's something about the heart, politics of the heart, something. I can't find it right now, but it's there was just a neat kind of online initiative aimed at women that was launched through Faith 2020 about faith in the heart and politics.
So one of the questions that got sent in, I think would be a fruitful one for you both to speak from, both your experience as leaders within the church and community of faith, but also the parts of the country where you come from are different. And the question was really how to understand and frame the Front Street white supremacy that showed up in the middle of a presidential debate. Mm-hmm. I mean, Diana, you've shared some of your background, and for those that don't know, Ryan's from Appalachia, and is a Baptist minister from Appalachia who's in the military. So that's a particular community to come from. So how would y'all kind of help us understand what was happening there and where your own morals and values help you frame a faithful response?
Well, when this whole 4 years, what can you say? The racial piece has been front and center. And I don't know that I can talk about it in any kind of way that's even objective at this point. I think that for me, the worst moment was Charlottesville. And it's interesting because that's become part of some of the campaigns. But it was really painful for me because my daughter was a student at UVA. And we know Charlottesville really well, and we love that place. And that night to see, Nazis walking across a lawn, admittedly with a conflicted history of slavery and racism on its own. I mean, but then to have that space, which Virginians have already been trying to deal with in new ways, the space of UVA, the space of slavery in our state, the space of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. We're working on this in Virginia, and we care about it, and we're really struggling with our past and with our future. And so all of that was already going on, but then to see those Nazis walk across that lawn and claim that space, and to take space that and desecrate it at that level, and then the next day to have the violence in the streets and the murder of Heather Heyer and the injury of, I think, about a dozen other people. It was terrible, and the reason why that was terrible for me is for all those public reasons, but it was also terrible for me because it caused my brother and I have not spoken since Charlottesville. And it was that he got on social media and he literally said, it's always terrible when somebody dies. He's a Catholic. My brother is a Catholic, a very conservative Catholic. And he says, always terrible when someone dies. But nevertheless, if you're going to be in a street and you support Antifa, you deserve it. And I literally lost it on my brother because my daughter had friends who were standing with Heather Heyer and who could have been killed. And had it just been 4 days later, my daughter would have been in the street with her friends and she could have been killed. And so I came back at my brother and I said, are you insane? I said that one, that could have been your niece. And two, our parents would be absolutely ashamed of you for ever saying anything like this. You were not raised that way. Well, that was the moment in which all of a sudden, as soon as I said that on Facebook, I was blocked. Every comment I made was taken down. I tried to call him. My phone number was blocked. He's returned all of my emails. He has not spoken to me since that day. And so for my family and my poor sister, who shares my opinions and models my parents' teachings on all these things as much as I do, she lives in Arizona. And so anyway, if my poor sister has been in the middle of all of this whole time. And, it's destroyed our family. It's destroyed the capacity for the siblings in my family to have any kind of relationship. And so for me, it's been this in-your-face, public, violent issue since the very beginning of the Trump administration that has done nothing but make me more committed to equality and to dealing with the historical fallout that we have never dealt with of racism, and look at my own life in new ways. My sister and I talk about all these things in much more generous and also personally overt ways to hold each other accountable, and have been learning together about a lot of things over these last years. But it's also, we've lived this, Trump destroyed my family. I feel sad. And my brother was always a troubled person, but now he's become a overt white supremacist who supports supports things like the Proud Boys, and it's awful.
I
can't do anything about it either.
I thank you for that vulnerability and for sharing that, Diana, because, when we talk about how to think about these existential issues of theology and ethics in public life, your voice is often the one that many of us goes to first for how to articulate it. But in your explanation to make it personal is really meaningful, especially in this moment. I was worried about doing too much in public today because I'm exhausted. I mean, I've been leading a group of clergy for 125 days here in Louisville around the Breonna Taylor protests. I have an uncle on his deathbed in West Virginia right now from COVID. His wife has COVID. My Trump supporting uncle and his wife got COVID from him, as did my two cousins, all of them suffering right now from that disease, but also from systemic issues of poverty and lack of access to good healthcare and healthcare solutions throughout the country, and particularly in Appalachia. And so thank you for being personal. I was reminded the other day, amidst all of the chaos that we're going through, of Helen Keller's quote that faith is the strength by which a shattered world shall emerge into the light. And I grew up in communities where some of my friends would say, the South shall rise again. Yeah. And they weren't just joking when they would say that. They wouldn't just wear it on a T-shirt. It wasn't just a cultural statement, although it was that. The truth of the matter is we have never gone through an atonement and a reconciliation or a conciliation, as my Reverend Rose Spalding says, because we were never conciliatory in the first place, but we've never atoned for our first original sins in this country. And so when I talk to people in my family throughout the mountains, throughout the South, I tend to do two things. The first thing is try to establish some sort of commonality and empathy. I thought my brother Tyler Childers, the musician, brilliant musician from here in Eastern Kentucky.
Oh.
did a wonderful job explaining this the other day when he produced a video about his song, Long Violent History. And he said, how would we in Appalachia feel if our brother was reaching down into his tackle box and the game warden shot him 6 times in the back? And he gave all of these culturally relevant examples. That is what our neighbors and our siblings who are Black have been experiencing for a long time. I mean, here in Louisville, we know full well that if you're Black in this country, you're not safe on the streets. I learned that when Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's, called asking if we could do a campaign for justice for him years ago. You're not safe in your car, as we know from Sandra Bland. You're not safe in the city park. You're not safe in the school. And as we've learned with Breonna Taylor, you're not even safe in your own home. Because if your door gets broken down by plainclothes people and you get killed in your own home and have to sit there in your own blood for over 20 minutes with nobody providing care for you, no justice will be done for you. And then last week, they said, open up the churches. Make sure people have a safe space in the churches. So we opened up the churches.
Right.
And then the police surrounded our church for 2 of the 4 nights, not letting people come in or out of worship for more than 3.5 hours, and telling everyone that they're not safe in the church. They actually applied for a warrant to enter the church. Now, thank goodness it was denied. And so I try to explain to folks that reality that we can only hear. We can't truly ever feel, but we can at least potentially empathize. And then the thing that I say that I think is critical in these dark moments, I remember vividly one of the people that I call my spiritual mothers in organizing, Dolores Huerta. I was sitting with her right after the election in 2016. And I said, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? And she said, we got through Reagan. We got through Nixon. And she reminded me of the opportunity that can happen for progress in deep moments of despair and deep moments of chaos. And she said, we can make the most progress out of this if we're smart, if we stick together, if we love one another enough. We can turn this into a moment of progress if we just don't give up amidst all the pain. And I have to say, if people like Dolores are still holding on and are willing to say, go out and vote, let's keep this going, then I have no excuses.
Wow. And what strikes me about both of your responses is there are specific stories that make, this election, personal. Like, it's not just moral in the abstract sense; it's personal, and I think that when when the individualism too often supported by Christianity finds its hold in our imagination, then we don't take seriously those relationships as places to reflect politically. I had a conversation with a longtime friend, long enough they're basically our family, who was concerned that I found a certain political meme very humorous, and he decided to FaceTime me late at night to edify me, and he goes, well, just don't give me your political, philosophical mumbo jumbo, theological twisties to vote for, or why you're going to go voting for Biden. He's like, I know you don't even like him that much because you think he's too moderate. And I said, yeah, but and I said this, like, I was a youth minister for a long time, right? Like, I was 15 years, and I was part of confirming 148 teenagers, and each week I pray for all of them on specific days.
Wow.
And one of them was David Hogg, right? And all of a sudden, when there's a shootings in school, and I find out it's his school, and then all the people that are in youth group are texting and messaging, like that experience to know that there's this kid that you got to be a part of his faith formation. You had Super Bowl party at his house, you know, his sister, his mom and dad, and that you don't even know yourself without the experiences of sharing as a minister with individuals coming of age and getting that awkward question and like, can I get a ride? Because I really want to talk to you, but I don't want to tell you I want to talk to you. Like you have those moments with people. And so you pray for them and you follow their life. And then the idea that they were just at school and he lost a number of his friends, and it could have been him or it could have been his sister. And then he and his friends organize and act and take steps out. Like the idea that it's okay to not act and to not be invested, so that that less people get their days interrupted by the sheer terror and fear of knowing that their loved ones are in a space getting gunned down and they were just at school, right? Like like there are plenty of other reasons that are you know more important in some like abstract sense, like climate change or economic injustice. But I think there's more and more people with the deaths from COVID coming on, with the awareness of systemic injustice bearing violence, that there are names and faces that for just this person, you can show up and make a difference. And those stories, like just in how I responded to hearing news, are more important than just the fact that I don't know how you could be a follower of Jesus and vote for Donald Trump with a straight face. And I don't mind exegeting my way through it. But that is not the same thing as saying, like, I was David Hogg's youth minister, and I don't want anyone to have that experience. And I had this breakup in my family, and it has hurt, and it's harmful. And the state surrounded a church and wouldn't let us go in or go out because we think it's immoral that Breonna Taylor was murdered. Like, there's so many examples. And I think telling those is important because the moral question at the heart of this moment is, do we want to move in a place where less people have those stories to tell? And there's no one with it. Like, I just don't understand thinking 4 more years of this is going to go in a positive direction. And anyway, it's really overwhelming, but I just, for all that, I will enthusiastically hold my nose for Joe Biden. You know what I mean?
I was thinking about something today, that a lot of white people talk about the idea of building the kingdom. And I think that that's like the wrong language. And you just sort of pointed it out. For me, it's about weaving this language I hear sometimes used like in the United Church of Christ, but it's good language. Weaving the kingdom of God. And that word kin comes from the word kind. And I was rereading some Julian of Norwich, and a medieval mystic, and she talks about our kind Lord. And that's one of the things that we've really lost in all this. And all of our stories are about that. It's about the brokenness. And the world is always broken in ways and wounded in ways, but it can be less so. There can be that weaving. There can be the healing of wounds. There can be a stitching together of the fabric of being human and the fabric of creation. And we can be sewers and weavers. And that's what I want. And I'm not much interested in building the kingdom of God. That's the bad language. Hierarchical, control-oriented. And so if you're going to think about politics as building the kingdom of God, I am not on your ship. Mm-hmm. But if we can think about a political life, and I keep thinking, I love being on a call with 2 guys who are talking about how politics is personal, or the personal is politics. That was the old mantra of 1970s feminism. Personal is political. If we can think about the truth of that, It's not about establishing some reign of God here on earth. It's about a fabric that stretches over our communities and creation. And what do we do to repair the holes in that fabric? And that's what I want to do. That's all I've ever wanted to do, really, my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different kind of political vision, and it's one that I think we're more deeply. I think that it's making itself more known, or that people are longing for that. And in many ways, I think a lot about womanist theologians too. Nobody ever has to tell them that because they were already doing it naturally. Mm-hmm. I had to learn that, but I did learn it as a feminist, and I certainly heard it very quickly as a woman. And I'm glad that guys are kind of getting it now too.
When you use the weaving the kingdom of God line in my first Jesus book, not the new one, there's a chapter called Abba says drop the G out of kingdom, because kingdom has hierarchy and patriarchy in it, which is kind of like the opposite of everything Jesus says. And I guess you may not believe this, but the church actually has not caught the poetic sophistication of overturning an image, and then they just decide to lash back onto the patriarchy and hierarchy. So in the book, I talk about how theologians wrestle with different ways and what it means to historical Jesus. But I say Abba drops a G, because if you get rid of the G and say kingdom, you get rid of the cock and the crown. And it's very high quality joke you can use in very small situations. I'll just say, if you put it in a fortress book, they will change cock to phallus and not tell you. So you could get your new book and be reading it, the first printed copy, to people at a book release party, and you read phallus and the crown. And that is awkward and not better. That doesn't help at all. So I deeply resonate with that sentiment, and so I wanted to ask, want y'all to respond. One last question as we wrap up, and everybody that's enjoying this and stuff and wants to continue talking with us as election season goes on, make sure you go to ruiningdinner.com. It was too heartfelt and sentimental. I needed to ruin dinner by making a Jesus-related joke associating it with a phallus. That always makes everyone's dinner come back up. The last question is, thinking of this moment, like a lot of more progressive Christians' intuitions, right, about their more conservative brethren, became clear, right? Like the worst thoughts I thought on my worst days and most judgy days, all of a sudden are being performed. And the question that came in was, is it better to admit that we're just in different religions, or at least different Christianities, or what does the word mean in a moment like this, where the story you're proclaiming and the one you're living out seems so at odds?
I don't know, Ryan, you want to go first?
Election cycles are not the time to answer that question, because when I was being trained as a campaign manager, my mentor told me, if your candidates agree on 98% of everything, you have 2% worth of a campaign. And so by their very nature, political seasons are polarizing, because you're forcing people to make a singular decision when, at least for people of faith, we're not electing a Messiah or a values leader necessarily. We're electing, I like to say, the person who we would rather negotiate with at the other end of a table. And so I think that recognizing, though, that we still must cling to the values that we all hold deeply to in a democracy is important. And I think those are some of the values that Donald Trump wants to tear away, if we'll let him, if we'll let this abuser in chief take even more from us. And I don't think we can do that. I think regardless of whether people support him on policy or not, we all have to agree that violence in an election season is not appropriate, that counting every vote is required, that peaceable transition of power is required. And we have to prepare for that to happen. And we also have to prevent the bad from happening and spend as much time on prevention as we do preparation, because ultimately we'll manifest whatever we're preparing for.
That's right.
In the long run, though, I will say this. My hope is that we never, as Christians, and I'll just speaking from my tradition, we never give up on redemption. I mean, I grew up in a town surrounded by beliefs, and even had some of them myself, that were highly discriminatory against LGBTQ people, highly patriarchal. And if I was still treated as the person who had those same beliefs 25, 35 years ago, then God help me and God help everybody around me. I mean, I think people have the capacity to change, and we can never give up hope that God loves all of us just for who we are, and loves us far too much to have us all stay that way. And so I never give up on redemption. Theologically, do I worship a different God than Franklin Graham? Probably. I'm not against saying that publicly, but I don't know for sure. I can only focus on practicing my faith and enacting a theology that lifts people up and brings about new life and new hope instead of tearing people down. And I do think that the theology of inviting Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior into your own heart, as Father Rohr said, happened starting in the year 1313, is a destructive theology that too closely marries individualism and consumerism with Christianity, and is not the faith of the person who we claim to follow in Jesus Christ. I know that. And so if they're following a Jesus that isn't a person of color who was an undocumented refugee, who was poor, and then killed by the authorities of his day, and Jewish, if they're not following that person, then maybe we don't follow the same faith. I think it's a worthy conversation. And I'll finally before I shut up, because I apologize, Diana, I talk in paragraphs. I wish we could be just as bold in saying that what we're doing is Christian as Jerry Falwell was, as Franklin Graham is, because they act as if there's no other Christianity out there other than the white conservative person who thinks we ought to get rid of Roe v. Wade. And that has never been the majority of us. And yet we act like we have to sort of give space to the other side when our folk are getting killed in the streets and people are dying of poverty, and we can't boldly say as a public witness that is unchristian. That's the posture that I hope we take. That doesn't mean we stop having conversations with those folk.
Well, there's a lot that Ryan said that actually quite a bit agree with. Over this whole election season, I have resisted the fake Christian narrative. You've seen a lot of that hashtag going up. And people have actually asked me to help sponsor campaigns that talk about fake Christian. And I've very politely turned that down. You know, I understand why people are saying that, and I understand the point they're trying to make, but I just can't go there. And part of the reason I can't go there personally is because, and this is the historian, Diana, that always gets kicked on overdrive at times like this. And that is, 100 years from now, somebody's going to look back at my life and what I believe and say, oh, how could she have ever believed that? That's not real Christianity. That's fake Christianity. And I don't want to be judged like that. I would hope that whoever that is 100 years from now, who's looking back at me, would be able to say, well, she was a person who lived in a particular time and a particular context, and she did the best she could. And given that, she actually did pretty well. And we all interpret this God. None of us has a bead right into getting it correct. And we're all going to make mistakes, and we're all incredibly imperfect. And I don't think that lets me off the hook for just sort of saying, oh, they're Christians too, blah, 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 blah. And it's all equal. I'm not trying to both sides this. But what I am saying is that there are really, truly different interpretations of what it means to be a Christian. And I can critique other interpretations, but I don't think that I have the freedom to say that person isn't a Christian or that person doesn't worship God. Because the truth of the matter is, as a progressive Christian, I hang around with Sikhs and Muslims and Buddhists and Jews all the time, and I think we all worship the same God with just different names. And so for me then to turn around and say, well, Franklin Graham, he worships a different God, somehow that seems very narrow and even perhaps cruel of me to do in the framework of my larger theological vision. And so in that larger theological vision that calls me to be my best self, I'm not going to say that Franklin Graham worships a different God or that he's a fake Christian. I can say that he's a Christian who I believe gets a lot wrong.
Well, I'm impressed. Both of y'all are named Franklin Graham or that nice. Didn't use the word Marduk. I think that's probably what I would have said, but I'm not going to answer the question. I appreciate all Ryan joining us. It was great to have you on. I want to give you a second to make sure you let everyone know where to go on the internet to find out about the new moral majority and such. And if you are on, then you clearly should go to ruiningdinner.com so you can hang out with Diana and I, and who knows what of our friends are going to show up. I didn't know Ryan was going to be so nice and heartfelt and stuff. I'd find someone that, can ruin your dinner next time. We can't ask Brian McLaren to come. We know he'd be nice and pastoral. Who's someone that's going to say something utterly offensive and make someone burp up? I got to find somebody. But go ruiningdinner.com and have a good old time with us during this election. I say good old time, but you know what I really mean, right? Yeah. Exactly. I'm leaning into the positivity. But yeah, I'm currently trying. A bunch of my friends, we all have a little bet of if we could, none of us could drink all month long throughout the election. So it's like group torture. So sober October during election season with Donald Trump going crazy. And so I imagine we'll all break it at some point, but there's money on the line. If that's legal.
It's a good goal. I actually have friends that are doing the same things because they found they were drinking too much.
Yeah, so you gotta reset for election night. You know what I mean?
I have water. This is water.
Yeah, I got a fruity carbonated beverage. So Ryan, let us know about New Moral Majority and where to head.
Yeah, go to newmoralmajority.com. The first ad, Sermon to Heal America, will be out tomorrow on that website, newmoralmajority.com. You can also find us, of course, on Facebook and Twitter.
Awesome. Well, that was fun, and I appreciate everyone hanging out, and I'm glad no one died.
Try to be more ruinous next time, Trip.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought about asking some specific questions, but then I thought I'd get in trouble for knowing too much about you.